There was a garden in Florence where ancient marble heads lay half buried in the earth, like pale fruit fallen from some forgotten tree, and among them a boy moved slowly, touching the stone faces with his fingers, tracing the line of a jaw, the hollow of an eye socket, learning the geography of what he would spend his entire life trying to recover. The garden belonged to Lorenzo de' Medici, and the boy was 13 years old, his nose already broken in a fight with a fellow apprentice, his hands already scarred from the chisel. His name was Michelangelo Buonarroti, and he had been sent there to learn sculpture, but what he learned instead was something closer to religion. The marble was cold under his hands. The heads were older than anyone living, older than the city itself, fragments of a world that had known how to make gods that looked like men and men that looked like gods. He would spend the rest of his life trying to close that distance. He was born on the 6th of March, 1475, in a small hill town called Caprese, where his father was serving a brief term as podesta, a kind of local magistrate. The family was minor Florentine nobility, genteel and broke, clinging to the memory of better days the way certain families do, with a kind of exhausted pride. His mother was Francesca di Neri del Miniato di Siena. She died when he was 6. He was sent to live with a stonecutter's family in Settignano, just outside Florence, where the wet nurse who fed him was herself the daughter and wife of stonecutters. He would later say, half joking, that he sucked in the chisel and mallet with her milk. The landscape around Settignano was all pale Pietra Serena stone, quarried and cut for the buildings of Florence, and the sound of hammering on stone was the sound of his childhood. The hills were chalky and dry in summer, silver green with olive trees, and everywhere you walked you could find chips of marble in the dust. His father wanted him to be a merchant or a clerk, something respectable and clean. But the boy drew constantly, obsessively, filling the margins of pages with figures, and by the time he was 13 his father had given up and apprenticed him to Domenico Ghirlandaio, one of the busiest painters in Florence. Ghirlandaio's workshop was a factory of images, turning out frescoes for wealthy patrons, filling churches with narrative cycles of saints and biblical scenes. It was methodical work, collaborative. Michelangelo lasted a year. What he learned there was useful: how to prepare a wall for fresco, how to paint on wet plaster before it dried, the speed and certainty required. But it was not what he wanted. He wanted something older, something harder, something that resisted. He wanted stone. Lorenzo de' Medici had established the sculpture garden as a kind of informal academy, a place where young artists could study the antique fragments in his collection under the guidance of Bertoldo di Giovanni, an aging sculptor who had been a student of Donatello. It was not a formal school, more a gathering place, a room full of old stones and young men. Michelangelo was admitted sometime around 1489, and within months Lorenzo had taken notice of him. The story goes that Michelangelo carved a faun's head in marble, copying an ancient model, and Lorenzo, passing through the garden, stopped to look. He remarked that the faun's mouth was open and laughing, but the teeth were too perfect an old creature would have lost some. Michelangelo, the story goes, immediately took up his chisel and knocked out one of the teeth, chipping the gum to suggest age. Whether this happened exactly as told is less important than what it reveals about how he thought even then. The detail mattered, the body mattered, and the stone had to carry the truth of the flesh. Lorenzo invited him into the household. For 3 years, from roughly 1490 to 1492, Michelangelo lived in the Palazzo Medici, ate at Lorenzo's table, studied with Lorenzo's sons, was educated by the Neoplatonic philosophers and poets who gathered there: Marsilio Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, Angelo Poliziano. He was 15, 16, 17, living inside the most intellectually alive circle in Europe, absorbing a worldview that synthesized Christian theology with Platonic idealism, that saw the human body as a microcosm of divine order, that believed beauty was not decoration but a path to truth, The conversations in that household were about the soul's ascent, about love as a ladder between earth and heaven, about the visible world as a shadow of invisible forms. And all around him were the Medici's antiquities, Roman torsos, Greek heads, fragments of limbs and drapery, evidence that once, long ago, artists had known how to make stone breathe. He made very little in those years that survives. There is a relief of the Madonna of the Stairs, carved in shallow layers like a Roman tomb sculpture, the Virgin seated in profile on a block of stone, the Christ child asleep in her lap, her hand steadying him, her face abstracted, almost severe. The whole thing is compressed, quiet, the space shallow as memory. And there is the battle of the centaurs, a tangle of muscled bodies fighting, struggling, interlocked in a way that is almost illegible, a relief so crowded and energetic that the figures seem to push out of the stone toward you. It is unfinished, rough in places, but it already contains everything he would do later: the fascination with the male body, the complexity of interlocking forms, the sense that the stone is barely holding the figures inside. Lorenzo de' Medici died in April of 1492. Michelangelo was 17. The world he had been admitted to collapsed almost immediately. Lorenzo's son Piero took over, arrogant and politically incompetent, and within 2 years the Medici were driven out of Florence by a popular uprising. The French king Charles VIII invaded Italy, marching his army south toward Naples, and Florence, in a spasm of religious fervor, fell under the influence of a Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola, who preached that the city's wealth and paganism had brought God's wrath upon it. There were bonfires of vanities in the Piazza della Signoria, where people threw paintings, books, mirrors, cosmetics, anything beautiful or vain into the flames. Michelangelo fled to Bologna, then to Rome. He was 21, without a patron, without a household, carrying nothing but his tools and the memory of that garden. In Rome he found work almost immediately. A cardinal named Raffaele Riario commissioned a sculpture of Bacchus, the god of wine, life-size in marble. Michelangelo carved the young god, drunk, swaying slightly, his belly soft, his expression dazed, holding a cup in one hand and a bunch of grapes in the other, his body graceful and fleshy, and slightly too real. Behind him, barely visible, is a small satyr eating the grapes, grinning. The whole thing is pagan, erotic, beautiful, and slightly unsettling. Riario rejected it. Another patron, a banker named Jacopo Galli, bought it instead and set it up in his garden among the ancient sculptures. It looked, people said, like it belonged there. Like it had been dug up from the earth, not made by a living hand. Michelangelo had already managed a similar trick. Before the Bacchus, he had carved a sleeping Cupid, deliberately aged it to look ancient, and sold it through a dealer as a genuine antiquity. The cardinal who bought it eventually discovered the forgery and demanded his money back, but instead of being angry, he was impressed. Here was a young sculptor who could work in the style of the ancients so convincingly that even experienced collectors were fooled. The cardinal invited Michelangelo to Rome, and the forgery became the foundation of his reputation. He could do what no one else could do, make the old world live again. In 1498, a French cardinal named Jean de Bilher commissioned a Pietà for his tomb chapel in St. Peter's Dun, The subject was traditional: the Virgin Mary holding the dead Christ across her lap after the crucifixion, but the treatment was not. Michelangelo carved them both young, impossibly beautiful, their bodies smooth and idealized, Mary's face calm, almost serene, her drapery cascading in deep folds around her, Christ's body limp and perfect, every muscle articulated, his head fallen back, his hand open. There is no blood, no suffering. The whole thing is about stillness, about the moment after grief, when grief becomes something else. Mary is enormous, her body large enough to hold him, her lap wide and stable, and Christ is small, almost childlike, gathered back into her arms. The marble is polished, so smooth it seems to glow from within. When it was unveiled, people could not believe it had been made by a living hand. Some said it had been carved by angels. Others said it was made by a much older, more experienced sculptor, and Michelangelo had merely claimed it. He carved his name across Mary's sash, the only work he ever signed, in a fit of anger or pride. Michelangelo Buonarroti, Florentine, made this. He was 24 years old. The Pietà made him famous. By the time he returned to Florence in 1500, he was already spoken of as the best sculptor in Italy, maybe the best since antiquity. The city was different than he remembered. The Medici were still in exile, Savonarola had been burned at the stake for heresy, and the Republic was trying to fashion itself into a model of civic virtue and artistic ambition. The Opera del Duomo, the board that oversaw the cathedral, had a problem. For 40 years, a massive block of Carrara marble had been sitting in the works yard behind the cathedral, abandoned. It was 18 feet tall, narrow, already partially worked by two other sculptors who had both given up on it. The marble had a flaw running through it, a vein of softer stone that made it difficult to carve, and the proportions were awkward. It was considered unusable. Michelangelo asked to see it. He walked around it slowly, studying it from every angle, and then he told them he could carve a figure from it. A David, the young hero who killed Goliath, the symbol of Florence itself. He worked on it for 3 years, alone, in a workshop built around the block. He worked standing up, sometimes through the night, by candlelight, the air thick with marble dust. The statue emerged slowly, impossibly, from that narrow, flawed block. David stands upright, weight on one leg, his body in contrapposto, the classical stance of ease and tension, his left hand holding the sling over his shoulder, his right hand hanging loose at his side, the veins and tendons carved so precisely you can see the blood beneath the stone. His head is turned slightly to the left, looking toward some unseen threat, his brow furrowed, his eyes watchful. He is not shown after the battle triumphant, holding Goliath's head. He is shown before, in the moment of decision, the moment when the boy becomes the hero. He is huge, over 14 feet tall, naked, perfect, every muscle articulated, the body of an athlete or a god. And his face serious, concentrated, unafraid is the face of a young man who knows what he is about to do. When the statue was finished in 1504, a committee was convened to decide where to place it. Leonardo da Vinci was on the committee. So was Botticelli. So was Giuliano da Sangallo and Filippino Lippi and a dozen others. They debated for hours. Some wanted it inside the Loggia dei Lanzi, sheltered from the weather. Others wanted it on the steps of the cathedral. Michelangelo said nothing. In the end, they chose the most prominent spot in the city, the Piazza della Signoria, in front of the Palazzo Vecchio, where it would stand as the symbol of the Republic, the young hero facing down tyranny, visible to everyone who entered the square. It took 4 days to move it there, 40 men hauling it on rollers through the streets, and when it was finally set in place, people stood in silence. Some wept. It was not just a sculpture. It was proof that the ancient world had not been lost, that what the Greeks and Romans had done could be done again, here, now, in Florence. And more than that, it was proof of what a single man, working alone, could achieve. The statue was almost immediately called the Giant. But the giant was not David, it was Michelangelo. He was 29 years old, and there was no one in Italy who did not know his name. Fame did not make him easier. He was difficult, suspicious, quick to anger, quick to take offense. He fought with patrons, with fellow artists, with his own family, who constantly demanded money from him, which he sent resentfully, feeling exploited even as he could not refuse them. He was not handsome. His nose, broken in adolescence, was flattened and crooked, his face rough and asymmetrical, his clothes often dirty. He slept in his boots, sometimes for weeks. He ate little, irregularly, and lived in chaotic studios filled with stone dust and half-finished blocks. He wrote letters full of complaints about money, about commissions, about the ingratitude of patrons, about his own body. which hurt constantly. His back, his hands, his eyes, which were damaged from years of looking up while painting. He wrote poetry, too, strange naughty sonnets in the style of Petrarch, full of longing and self-loathing and a kind of spiritual exhaustion. The poems are about beauty, about desire, about the gap between what he could imagine and what he could make, about his own ugliness, his own inadequacy, his sense that the body was both the soul's temple and its prison. In 1505, Pope Julius II summoned him to Rome. Julius was a warrior pope, ambitious, impatient, obsessed with restoring the power and grandeur of the papacy and the city of Rome itself. He wanted Michelangelo to design his tomb, a massive freestanding monument that would be placed in the new St. Peter's Basilica, which Julius was planning to rebuild from the ground up. Michelangelo drew up plans for a three-tiered structure covered with over 40 life-size marble figures, prophets, sibyls, allegories, slaves, culminating in a statue of the Pope himself, triumphant, at the top. It would be the largest, most elaborate tomb ever built. Michelangelo went to Carrara to select the marble himself, spent 8 months in the quarries, supervising the cutting and transport of block after block. When he returned to Rome, Julius had lost interest. The money for the tomb was being diverted to the new basilica, to the architect Bramante, whom Michelangelo despised and suspected of sabotaging him. Michelangelo was furious. He left Rome without permission, fleeing back to Florence, and Julius, equally furious, demanded he. Eventually, after months of negotiation, he did. But the tomb was postponed. Instead, Julius had another project for him. He wanted Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo refused. He was a sculptor, not a painter. He had barely painted since his apprenticeship with Ghirlandaio, and that was frescoes on flat walls, not a barrel-vaulted ceiling 60 feet above the floor. He told Julius it was a bad idea, that he would fail, that Bramante had suggested it precisely because he wanted Michelangelo to fail and humiliate himself. Julius did not care. He was the Pope. He insisted. And so, in the spring of 1508, Michelangelo began work on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, angry, resentful, convinced it would be a disaster, and determined, if he had to do it in a way no one else could imagine. The ceiling was already painted. 20 years earlier, it had been decorated with a simple blue field dotted with gold stars, a conventional sky. Julius wanted something more ambitious, something that would match the grandeur of the chapel, which was the Pope's private chapel and the site of the conclave where new popes were elected. The walls were already frescoed by the best painters of the previous generation: Botticelli, Perugino, Ghirlandaio, with scenes from the lives of Moses and Christ. The ceiling, Julius decided, should depict the Old Testament, the stories before Moses, the first days of the world. Michelangelo designed the scaffolding himself, a wooden platform suspended from holes drilled into the upper walls, arching over the floor so that Mass could still be said below while he worked. He started with a team of assistants, painters brought from Florence to help him. But he hated their work. Within weeks, he fired all of them, plastered over what they had done, and locked himself inside the chapel. For the next 4 years, he painted essentially alone. He mixed his own plaster, ground his own pigments, did his own guillorné dissections of wet plaster that had to be painted in a single day before they dried. He worked lying on his back on the scaffolding, or crouched, or twisted sideways, his neck bent backward, his arm raised above his head, paint dripping into his face, his eyes, his beard. His letters from this period are full of pain. His spine was curved from the awkward position, his vision distorted from looking up for hours at a time. He wrote a sonnet about it, half comic, half bitter, his stomach pressed against his chin, his beard pointing at the sky, his chest like a harpy's, his brush dripping colors onto his face, his loins shoved into his gut, his ass serving as a counterweight. "I am not in a good place," he wrote, "and I am not a painter." And yet, What he painted was the most ambitious single work of visual narrative in Western art. The ceiling is 5,000 square feet of fresco, divided into 9 central panels flanked by prophets and sibyls, surrounded by ignuti nude youths and ancestors of Christ, and lunettes over the windows, all organized into a coherent architectural framework painted in tremble look like real marble and stone. The 9 central panels tell the story of Genesis, from the creation of the world to the drunkenness of Noah. He painted them in reverse order, starting at the entrance with the Noah scenes and working backward toward the altar, toward the beginning of time. As he went, the figures got larger, simpler, more powerful. The early panels are crowded with figures, complicated narratives. The later ones painted last, but chronologically first are vast and simple, a few enormous bodies moving through empty space. The creation of Adam is in the center of the ceiling. The 4th panel from the altar. God rushes in from the right, wrapped in a red cloak, his arm outstretched, his finger extended, surrounded by angels and a green billowing shape that some have read as a brain, as if God is bringing not just life, but consciousness. Adam lies on the left, his body perfect, muscular, languid, his arm raised, his finger reaching toward God's, not quite touching. The space between their fingers is the smallest gap in the history of art, and it contains everything, the moment before life begins, the distinction between human and divine, the unbridgeable distance and the intimate closeness between creator and creation. The background is empty, pale blue, nothing but sky. There is no landscape, no context, just the 2 figures and the gesture. It is the most famous image in Western art. It has been reproduced, parodied, referenced, copied so many times that it is almost impossible to see it anymore without the weight of all those reproductions. But if you stand beneath it, in the chapel, and look up, it is still shocking. The scale, the confidence, the simplicity, the way God's body is compressed, foreshortened, rushing toward you, and Adam's body is open, receptive, just waking. The way the whole image is built around that one gesture, that reaching, that almost touch. Michelangelo painted the entire ceiling in 4 years, finishing in October of 1512. When the scaffolding came down and the chapel was opened, people came from across Italy to see it. Raphael, who was at the height of his own fame, painting the papal apartments at the same time, changed his style after seeing it, making his figures larger, more sculptural, more Michelangelesque. Sebastiano del Piombo wrote to Michelangelo in Florence, where he had fled immediately after finishing, that everyone in Rome was stunned, that nothing like it had ever been done. Julius was triumphant. He had commissioned the greatest work of art of the age, and everyone knew it. Michelangelo was exhausted, half-blind, his body wrecked, and already being asked to do more. He returned to Florence, to the tomb of Julius, which still was not finished, which would never be finished, which would haunt him for the next 40 years. The original design had called for 40 statues. He carved a few: Moses, seated, holding the tablets of the law, his head turned sharply to the left, his expression fierce, his beard flowing down his chest in heavy coiled locks, his arms muscled and tense, as if he is about to rise. The statue was intended for an upper tier of the tomb, meant to be seen from below, but it ended up at eye level, in a much smaller, much less ambitious final version of the tomb, installed in San Pietro in Vincoli, in Rome decades later. Moses is furious, powerful, almost too large for his setting, and the intensity of his gaze, the suggestion of imminent movement, makes him seem alive in a way that is disturbing. Vasari tells the story, probably apocryphal, that Michelangelo, finishing the statue, struck it on the knee with his hammer and shouted, "Why don't you speak?" There is a small dent in the marble knee. Whether Michelangelo made it or not, the story captures something true about how people responded to his work. It was too real. It crossed some line. He also carved the prisoners, a series of unfinished figures intended for the lower tier of the tomb, muscular male bodies struggling to emerge from the marble, twisting, pushing, their forms only partially defined, still embedded in the stone. Some of them are barely begun, the body suggested by a few carved planes, the rest still rough. Others are almost complete, the anatomy articulated, but the head or the limbs still trapped, still part of the block. Michelangelo later gave them away, and eventually they ended up in Florence in the Accademia, where they stand now along a corridor leading to the David. They are among his most powerful works, and they are unfinished. Or, perhaps they are finished, and the unfinishedness is the point. He used to say that the figure was already inside the marble, and his job was simply to remove what was excess. These figures are caught in that process, half emerged, and the effect is not of incompleteness, but of revelation, of a body in the act of becoming. Julius died in 1513. His heirs renegotiated the tomb contract multiple times, always scaling it back, always accusing Michelangelo of not working fast enough, of taking on too many other commissions, of keeping their money without delivering the work. Michelangelo, for his part, felt he had been cheated, underpaid, overworked, and blamed for delays that were not his fault. The tomb became a source of shame and resentment that followed him the rest of his life. He called it the tragedy of the tomb. It was supposed to be his masterpiece, the work that would define his legacy, and it ended up a compromise, a fragment, a failure. In the meantime, the Medici had returned to Florence. Lorenzo's son Giovanni had become Pope Leo X in 1513, and Lorenzo's nephew Giulio, later Pope Clement VII, was running Florence. They wanted to turn the Church of San Lorenzo, the Medici parish church, into a dynastic monument. They commissioned Michelangelo to design a facade for the church which had never been completed, and to build a new sacristy to house the tombs of the Medici family. For the next 15 years, Michelangelo was consumed by Medici commissions, architecture, tombs, a library work that pulled him away from the Julius tomb, work that he resented even as it gave him the chance to design entire spaces, not just statues. The Medici Chapel, the new sacristy, is a square room with high walls, pietra serena pilasters, and two large wall tombs facing each other. On one wall, the tomb of Giuliano de' Medici, Duke of Nemours, Lorenzo the Magnificent's third son, who died young. On the other wall, the tomb of Lorenzo de' Medici, Duke of Urbino, Lorenzo the Magnificent's grandson, also dead young. Each tomb has a statue of the man seated in a niche above, and below, reclining on the curved lid of the sarcophagus, two allegorical figures representing times of day. On Giuliano's tomb, day and night. On Lorenzo's tomb, day and dusk. The figures are huge, over life-size, their bodies twisted and uncomfortable on the sloping lids, as if they might slide off at any moment. Night is a woman, asleep, her head resting on her hand, her body massive, muscular, her breasts heavy, her face lost in shadow. A mask lies near her feet, symbols of dreams. Day is a man, half-turned, looking back over his shoulder, his body unfinished, rough, the face barely suggested. Dawn is a woman, waking, her body melancholy. Dusk is a man, sinking down, his face tired, his head bowed. All four figures seem to be in pain, or at least discomfort. Their bodies are beautiful but strained, their expressions, where visible, are somber. They do not celebrate the dead. They mourn time itself, the inevitable passage, the weight of days. The chapel was never finished. The wall opposite the altar was supposed to have a double tomb for Lorenzo the Magnificent and his brother Giuliano, with a statue of the Madonna and Child in the center. Michelangelo carved the Madonna, a serene seated figure with the Christ child standing on her lap, twisting away from her, looking elsewhere, and she gazes down, her expression distant, melancholy, as if she already knows what will happen. The other statues were never made. In 1527, Rome was sacked by the armies of Charles V, and Pope Clement, trapped in Castel Sant'Angelo, lost control of Florence. The city rose up, drove out the Medici again, and reinstated the Republic. Michelangelo, who had been working for the Medici for years, sided with the Republic. He was made governor of the fortifications and spent months designing defensive walls and bastions to protect the city from the inevitable siege. When the siege came in 1529, Florence held out for months, but eventually, starved and betrayed, the city surrendered. The Medici returned. Michelangelo went into hiding, terrified he would be executed for treason. Clement pardoned him on the condition that he returned to work on the chapel. He did, but without enthusiasm, and by 1534, when Clement died, Michelangelo left Florence for good. He was 59 years old. He moved to Rome and never returned to Florence, though he lived another 30 years. In Rome he was immediately swept into another massive project. Pope Paul III wanted him to paint the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel, the same chapel whose ceiling he had painted 25 years earlier. The subject was the Last Judgment, the end of the world, Christ returning to judge the living and the dead, the saved rising to heaven, the damned cast down to hell. Michelangelo painted it between 1536 and 1541, covering the entire wall over 2,000 square feet, with a vast, chaotic, swirling mass of bodies. There are over 300 figures, all of them nude, all of them in motion, rising, falling, struggling, reaching. Christ is in the center, his right arm raised, his face stern, not a figure of mercy but of judgment, powerful and implacable, his body young and muscular, more like a god of antiquity than the suffering Christ of medieval art. Around him, saints hold the instruments of their martyrdom. St. Bartholomew holds his own flayed skin, and the face on the skin, sagging and distorted, is said to be a self-portrait of Michelangelo, a piece of empty flesh discarded. Below, the dead rise from their graves, pulling themselves out of the earth, and boats carry souls across the river to hell, where demons drag them down into a dark cave. The whole composition is a spiral, a vortex, bodies tumbling through space without ground, without horizon, without rest. It was controversial from the start. Some critics praised it as the most powerful image of divine justice ever made. Others were horrified by the nudity, by the muscularity of the figures, by the absence of traditional halos and hierarchies, by the fact that Christ himself looked like an ancient athlete rather than a Christian savior. One papal master of ceremonies, Biagio da Cesena, reportedly said it was more appropriate for a bathhouse than a chapel. Michelangelo, in revenge, painted Biagio's face onto Minos, the judge of hell, with donkey ears and a snake coiled around his legs. Biagio complained to the Pope, who responded, apocryphally, that his jurisdiction did not extend to hell, so he could not help him. After Michelangelo's death, another artist was hired to paint loincloths and drapery over the genitals of many of the figures, a campaign of censorship that continued for decades. Some of the drapery has since been removed in restorations, but much of it remains. The Last Judgment was finished in 1541. Michelangelo was 66. For most artists, this would be the end of the career, the final masterwork, the summation. For him, it was the middle. He lived another 23 years, and the work he did in those years is stranger, more inward, less concerned with beauty or virtuosity, more concerned with something harder to name. He was old now, famous beyond measure, treated with a reverence that made him uncomfortable. Vasari, who published the first edition of his Lives of the Artists in 1550, called Michelangelo divine and wrote about him as if he were still alive, which he was, which made the whole enterprise strange and hagiographic. People came from across Europe to meet him, to see his studio, to watch him work. He was not interested. He lived alone, in a modest house, surrounded by blocks of marble and drawings and letters. He had assistants, but he did not let them do much. He carved slowly now, his hands stiff, his vision poor. He worked in the evenings by candlelight, wearing a paper hat with a candle fixed to it, so he could see the stone in front of him. He fell in love twice in these years, or at least he wrote love poems to two people, which may or may not be the same thing. The first was Tommaso de' Cavalieri, a young Roman nobleman, handsome, educated, cultured, who became Michelangelo's friend and perhaps more. The poems Michelangelo wrote to him are passionate, intense, full of longing and adoration, and a kind of platonic idealization. "From your beautiful face I learn, my lord, what cannot be told here below," one begins. They are love poems, by any reasonable definition, though they are framed in the language of Neoplatonic devotion, the soul's love for beauty as a reflection of divine love. Tommaso remained Michelangelo's friend for the rest of his life, visited him often, managed his affairs after his death. What exactly the relationship was, physically, emotionally, is unknown and probably unknowable. Michelangelo was not secretive about his affection, but he lived in a time and a culture where male friendship and erotic love occupied overlapping and ambiguous spaces, and he left no clear account. The second was Vittoria Colonna, a poet and a widow, deeply religious, part of a circle of reform-minded Catholics who wanted the Church to return to a more inward, personal piety. She and Michelangelo met in 1538 when he was 63 and she was in her late 40s. They exchanged poems, letters, drawings. He made her a series of small chalk drawings of religious subjects, a Pietà, a crucifixion rendered with an intensity and intimacy unlike his public work. She admired him, encouraged him, and they seemed to have shared a deep spiritual kinship. She died in 1547, and he was devastated. He wrote later that his one regret was that when he visited her on her deathbed, he kissed her hand but not her forehead. It is one of the few moments in his life where he allowed himself to express regret about an emotional connection. Both relationships, with Tommaso and with Vittoria, seem to have been about longing and distance, about love as something that could not be fully consummated or fully expressed, and that gap, that tension, runs through all of his late work. He was appointed chief architect of St. Peter's Basilica in 1546, at the age of 71. The project had been going on for decades, through multiple architects, multiple popes, constant delays and redesigns. Michelangelo accepted the position on the condition that he would take no salary and that he would be given complete control over the design. For the next 18 years until his death, he dedicated himself to the basilica, redesigning the crossing, the dome, the exterior, simplifying the plan, stripping away the ornamental additions of previous architects, returning to a simpler, more monumental form. The dome, which was not completed until after his death, is his design, a massive double-shell structure that rises over the crossing, visible from across Rome, the defining silhouette of the city. He would not live to see it built, but he left detailed drawings and a wooden model, and his successors followed them. It is one of the largest domes in the world, and it holds the space beneath it with a kind of inevitability, as if it had always been there. In his final years, he carved 3 Pietà, all of them intended, at least initially, for his own tomb. The first, the Florentine Pietà, begun in the 1540s, shows the dead Christ being lowered from the cross, supported by the Virgin, Mary Magdalene, and Nicodemus, whose hooded face is thought to be a self-portrait. The figures are clustered together in a tight pyramidal composition, their bodies interlocking, and the whole group is rough, unfinished, the surfaces barely polished. At some point, Michelangelo, dissatisfied, began to destroy it, smashing Christ's left arm and leg. A student intervened, saved it, and later restored and finished parts of it. It ended up in Florence, in the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo, behind the cathedral where, 70 years earlier, he had carved the David from that flawed block. The second, the Palestrina Pietà, is disputed. Scholars are not certain it is by Michelangelo, but it is massive, blocky. The figures barely emerge from the stone, Christ's body hanging limp, the Virgin supporting him, their forms almost merged, almost a single shape. It has the weight and stillness of an ancient relief, something carved before the classical conventions were established. The third, the Rondinini Pietà, he worked on until the last days of his life. It is tall, thin, almost spectral. The Virgin stands upright, and Christ, dead, is held against her, his body vertical, his weight supported by hers, their two forms so intertwined that it is difficult to tell where one ends and the other begins. The carving is rough, the surface is barely defined, the anatomy abstracted, almost erased. Christ's legs are barely there, the forms suggested by a few planes of stone. His head, in an earlier version, was carved more fully, but Michelangelo cut it off and carved a new, smaller head, tilted and fragile, the face almost featureless. The Virgin's face is similarly abstract, the expression lost, the stone left rough. It is a work that seems to be moving backward, away from definition, away from the body, toward something more essential and more elusive. It does not look like his earlier work. It does not look like anything that came before. It is barely a sculpture in the traditional sense. It is more like a ghost, a memory, a whisper. He died on the 18th of February, 1564 in Rome, a few weeks before his 89th birthday. He had been working on the Rondinini Pietà 6 days before. Tommaso de' Cavalieri was with him. Vasari traveled from Florence but arrived too late. The Pope wanted him buried in St. Peter's, but his family, following instructions he had left, smuggled his body out of Rome and took it to Florence, where he was buried in Santa Croce, with a state funeral, attended by thousands. His tomb, designed by Vasari, has 3 allegorical figures representing painting, sculpture, and architecture, all mourning. Above them, a bust of Michelangelo, old, severe, his face lined, his expression stern. His estate was substantial. He had complained his entire life about being poor, about being exploited, about not having enough, but he left a fortune property, cash, investments. He had lived modestly, spent little on himself, and hoarded money the way he hoarded stone. His heirs found stacks of drawings in his studio. Many he had burned over the years, destroying sketches and studies because he did not want people to see how much effort the work required, did not want them to see the struggle behind the finished surface. What remained was still an enormous archive: figure studies, architectural plans, drafts of poems, letters. The drawings show bodies in every conceivable position, studies of hands, feet, torsos, musculature, the same form drawn over and over from different angles, trying to understand how it worked, how it moved, how it held weight. The ceiling of the Sistine Chapel became the standard by which all subsequent art was judged, and also the burden. Raphael absorbed it, adjusted his style, and thrived. Other artists were crushed by it. How do you follow the creation of Adam? How do you paint after the Last Judgment? The question haunted the next generation. Mannerism, the style that emerged in the decades after Michelangelo, is often described as an anxious response to his work: figures elongated, poses exaggerated, compositions destabilized, as if artists, unable to match his power, pushed his forms to extremes, trying to do something he had not already done. In some ways, his work closed as many doors as it opened. The myth of Michelangelo calcified quickly. He became the archetype of the solitary genius, the artist who does not collaborate, who does not compromise, who suffers for the work, who transcends the limits of the medium. Vasari's biography, revised and expanded after Michelangelo's death, described him in near-holy terms. He was Il Divino, the Divine One, sent by God to show what art could be. The story of his life became the story of a man locked in struggle with patrons, with the physical difficulty of the work, with his own impossibly high standards, and that struggle was framed as noble, as the necessary price of greatness. The unfinished works, the prisoners, the Rondinini Pietà, were read as evidence of the artist's torment, the unbridgeable gap between vision and execution, the work always falling short of the imagined ideal. This is not entirely wrong, but it is also not entirely right. Michelangelo was difficult, obsessive, perfectionist, isolated, but he was also practical, a businessman, a manager of quarries and studios and contracts. He was capable of great tenderness in his friendships, great loyalty. He was funny sometimes in his letters, capable of self-deprecation and irony. He was a poet, a reader, a man educated in the intellectual currents of his time. The myth flattens him, turns him into an icon, and in doing so makes him less strange, less specific, less human. The David stood in the Piazza della Signoria for 350 years, exposed to weather, to pollution, to political upheaval. It was vandalized several times, an arm broken off in a riot in 1527, restored. In 1873, it was moved indoors to the Accademia to protect it from further damage. A copy was placed in the piazza. Now tourists line up for hours to see the original, walking through a corridor lined with the prisoners, those unfinished, struggling forms, before arriving at the David, which stands alone at the end of the hall, spotlit, immense, polished, perfect. It is still overwhelming. The scale, the precision, the presence, it is almost too much. You want to look away, but you cannot. The Sistine Chapel ceiling is more fragile. Over the centuries, it darkened, covered with soot from candles, dirt from centuries of breath and heat and incense. In the 1980s, a controversial restoration cleaned the frescoes, removing layers of grime and, in the process, revealing colors no one had seen in centuries. The figures emerged bright, almost garish vivid pinks, greens, purples, oranges. Some scholars argued the restorers had gone too far, that they had stripped away not just dirt, but a final layer of shading. Michelangelo had applied to tone down the colors. Others said the colors were original, that the dark, subdued palette everyone had loved for centuries was just accumulated filth. The debate has not been resolved. The ceiling now looks different than it did for most of its history, and no one alive today knows for certain what Michelangelo intended. What remains indisputable is the ambition of it. The scale, the complexity, the confidence required to conceive and execute a work like that, alone in 4 years. It is not just the technical achievement, though that is extraordinary. It is the invention of a visual language that could contain both the physical beauty of the body and the immensity of theological history, that could make the creation of the world feel intimate and immediate, that could turn a ceiling into a cosmos. The Last Judgment is harder to love. It is darker, more chaotic, less hopeful. Christ is not a savior but a judge, and the judgment is harsh. The composition is not harmonious but turbulent, bodies falling through space without ground, without stability. It was painted after the sack of Rome, after the fracturing of the Church by the Reformation, after the collapse of the Renaissance optimism that had shaped his early work. It is a vision of the end of the world, and it feels like an ending. Some scholars see it as the beginning of the Counter-Reformation, a return to judgment and orthodoxy. Others see it as Michelangelo's personal despair, his awareness of mortality, his fear of divine wrath. It is probably both. He was 66, exhausted in pain, and he filled an entire wall with suffering. The late sculptures are the strangest part of his legacy. The Rondinini Pietà does not fit any narrative of progress or development. It is not a refinement of his earlier style. It is a negation of it. The bodies are barely there, the forms dissolving into the stone, the detail erased. It is the opposite of the David, the opposite of the Sistine ceiling. It is what happens when the pursuit of the ideal turns inward, when the body is no longer the container of the soul, but the obstacle, when the stone is no longer the medium for showing form, but for suggesting its absence. It is a haunting work, and it is hard to look at for long. It does not give you anything to hold on to. Michelangelo's relationship to his own body was fraught his entire life. He idealized the male form in marble and paint, carved and painted it with an intensity and precision that borders on worship. The bodies he made are perfect, muscular, balanced, beautiful, alive. His own body was, by his own account, ugly, broken, painful. He hated it. His poems return again and again to the beauty he could imagine and make, and the ugliness he inhabited. "I am trapped in this poor and fragile shell," he wrote, "where my soul is imprisoned. The body was both sacred and revolting, both the image of God and the source of suffering. This is the tension that runs through all his work, the thing that makes it more than just virtuosity. He did not simply make beautiful things. He made things that were caught between the divine and the earthly, between the ideal and the real, and he never resolved that tension. He lived inside it. His love for Tommaso dei Cavalieri and for Vittoria Colonna seems to have been of a piece with this. He loved them from a distance, in a mode that was spiritual, idealized, unconsummated. His poems to Tommaso are full of longing, but also full of Neoplatonic philosophy, the idea that the beauty of the beloved's face is a reflection of divine beauty, that love is a ladder that lifts the soul toward God. Whether this was a way of sublimating erotic desire into something acceptable, or whether it was genuine spiritual experience, or both, is impossible to say. Michelangelo left no confessions. He did not explain himself. The poems are all we have, and they are full of metaphor, full of classical and Christian references, written in a style that makes the personal almost inaccessible. But the longing is there. The gap between what is desired and what is possible. He was called divine in his own lifetime, but the word for him seems to have been a burden as much as a compliment. To be divine is to be held to an impossible standard, to be separated from ordinary human life, to be alone. And he was alone, more and more as he aged. His friends died. His family, whom he supported, remained distant, demanding. He worked constantly, driven by something he could not name, something that was not ambition, exactly, or not only ambition. It was more like necessity. He could not stop. Even in his 80s, half blind, his hands shaking, he was in the studio, carving. The Tomb of Julius, the tragedy of the tomb, was finally completed in 1545, 40 years after it was first commissioned. It is a sad, reduced thing, a wall monument in a minor church, with only a handful of the statues Michelangelo had originally planned. Moses is there, fierce and powerful, too large for the space, and two smaller figures, allegorical, not by his hand. The rest of the original design 40 statues, 3 tiers, a freestanding monument that would have been the wonder of Rome was abandoned. The heirs of Julius accused Michelangelo of fraud, of keeping their money without delivering the work. Michelangelo, who had spent decades intermittently working on the project, who had carved some of the most powerful sculptures of his career for it, felt cheated and humiliated. The contract was finally settled, the reduced tomb installed, and Michelangelo never spoke of it again, if he could avoid it. The years after Vittoria Colonna's death were marked by a turn inward. He wrote more poems, many of them religious, penitential, asking for forgiveness, expressing doubt about whether his art had been a distraction from God, whether he had spent his life worshipping the wrong things. Now I know how fraught with error was the fantasy that made art my idol and my king, one poem begins. It is a striking reversal for a man who had spent his entire life insisting on the dignity and importance of art, who had fought patrons and popes to defend his vision. But he was old, and the confidence of youth had long since left him. The poems suggest a man who was uncertain, afraid, trying to reconcile the work he had done with the salvation he hoped for. And yet he kept working. The designs for St. Peter's, the late Pietà, the architectural projects, he did not stop. If he doubted the value of art, he could not abandon it. It was the only language he had. In 1561, 3 years before his death, he wrote to Vasari, "It grieves me greatly that I cannot do what I would wish, and yet I am going forward as best I can." He was 86. He could barely hold a chisel, but he was still going forward. The dome of St. Peter's was completed in 1590, 26 years after his death, by Giacomo della Porta, following Michelangelo's plans. It is a miracle of engineering and form, a double shell of brick and stone, ribbed, soaring, visible from every corner of Rome. It defines the skyline the way the Eiffel Tower defines Paris or the Statue of Liberty defines New York. It is not just a building, it is a symbol, and it carries his name, even though he never saw it finished. The question of his sexuality has occupied scholars and biographers for centuries, and it is worth saying plainly, we do not know. The poems to Tommaso are love poems. Whether that love was physical, whether it was reciprocated in kind, whether Michelangelo acted on his desire or sublimated it, whether he understood himself as what we would now call gay or queer, or whether those categories are anachronistic and inadequate, none of this can be answered with certainty. He lived in a time when male friendship and male love existed in a different conceptual space than they do now, when Neoplatonic idealism provided a language for expressing desire that was both coded and sincere. The poems are evidence of deep feeling, but they are also performances, literary exercises shaped by convention and philosophy. The same is true of the relationship with Vittoria Colonna. The letters and poems suggest profound affection and spiritual kinship, but what that meant in practice, in the lived experience of two aging, deeply religious people, is not recoverable. What is clear is that Michelangelo lived most of his adult life alone, that he formed no lasting domestic partnership, that he had no children, that his emotional life, as far as we can see it, was shaped by longing and distance, and that the bodies he made male, muscular, idealized are some of the most charged and powerful images of human beauty in Western art. They matter to him in a way that goes beyond aesthetics. They are evidence of something he wanted and could not have, or could only have in marble. His influence is so pervasive that it is almost invisible. Every art student for 500 years has been taught to draw the figure by studying his work. Every sculptor working in stone has had to reckon with the David. Every architect designing a dome has had to think about St. Peter's. Every painter attempting a large-scale narrative has had to think about the Sistine ceiling. He set the standard, and the standard is impossible. No one has matched him. Some have tried Bernini, Rodin, but they moved in different directions, found different solutions. Michelangelo remains singular, and in that singularity, isolating. The Romantic period loved him, made him the hero of artistic suffering, the genius tortured by his own vision. The 20th century was more ambivalent, suspicious of the heroic individual, skeptical of the idea of genius, more interested in the social and collaborative aspects of art-making. But even the skeptics could not ignore him. The work is too powerful, too present. The ceiling is still there. The David is still there. The Pietà in St. Peter's, the one he carved at 24, is still there, still astonishing. In 1547, a Roman nobleman named Luigi del Riccio died, and Michelangelo, who had been his friend, wrote a series of epitaphs for him. One of them is a couplet, "Here lies Luigi. With him are buried kindness, love, and courtesy. And if the stone were not so hard, it would follow him." It is a strange, revealing little poem. The stone is hard. The stone does not follow. The stone remains, distrained. That is the work. He carved his last Pietà the Rondinini in the house where he died. It was still in his studio when Tommaso and the others arrived and found him gone. The stone was rough, the figures barely emerged, the forms dissolving. It was not finished. But maybe, in some other sense, it was. He had spent 90 years trying to release the figure from the stone, and here at the end, he was letting the stone take the figure back, letting the body dissolve into the block, letting the thing he had spent his life defining become undefined again. It is the end of something, but it is hard to say what. A life, certainly. A vision of art. A way of understanding the body. A way of understanding God. The stone is still there, in the Castello Sforzesco in Milan, mounted on a low platform, spotlit in a dim room. You can walk around it, see it from all sides, see how little is carved, how much is left rough. You can see the earlier version of Christ's head, still attached, abandoned, the new smaller head carved alongside it. You can see the Virgin's face, almost featureless, the stone barely touched. You can see how thin the figures are, how fragile, how close to disappearing. And you can see, if you look long enough, how two separate bodies have been carved into a single form, how the distinction between them is collapsing, how they are merging back into the block they came from, how they are returning. It is his last word, and it is barely a whisper, but it is there.